Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee. Got a hook grip on the cup. Got to practice that hook grip every day. I had a subscriber ask me yesterday a question about should they try to take their pendlay rows and lower them more slowly to get a better eccentric for more hypertrophy, and I answered no. And I think we should delve into this because this topic always comes up time and time again about eccentric reps, hypertrophy, all of that. What's the role of eccentric reps there? Aren't they better for hypertrophy? And guys, there's a bit of a mythology there. And the reason there's mythology there is that a lot of people noted years ago, I'm talking like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, like in the fitness world itself, not necessarily always sports sciences, that that you're stronger on the eccentric reps. So if you've reached muscle failure on the lifting of the weight, right? If you reached muscle failure, you still could do reps with the same weight on the lowering, the eccentric. And so you hadn't reached true muscle failure yet and all this. And so people started messing more and more with eccentrics in order to get more hypertrophy. And there is a place for certain exercises historically to where people have used eccentric-based exercises in order to help gain muscle, maybe in weak areas. That's how the Romanian deadlift was invented, to bring up hamstrings. Because a lot of powerlifting, weightlifting moves, things like that, in some cases may not give you maximum hamstring development, that sometimes all those various pulls from the floor and the squatting may leave the hamstrings lagging a bit, and it takes a little more effort to make sure that you build your hamstrings up to reduce injury rates and maybe give yourself an advantage in certain lifts. So that exercise kind of came into vogue. But the thing is, when you start looking at the data out there, eccentrics have kind of been overhyped a little bit, and it's not saying they don't add to your muscle growth. In other words, if you take an exercise and you only do the concentric with the same weight and reps, you tend to gain less muscle than if you do some sort of control on the eccentric only, right? Because you're doing more total work. But you need to remember it's easier to lower a weight than it is to raise it. In other words, your eccentric strength is sometimes, in some cases, 10 to 20% stronger than your concentric. So in other words, if you can lift a max of, say, 330 or 300 pounds on an exercise, right? You might find that you can lower 330 or 350 under some control on the way down, and then obviously get pinned at the bottom. So people need to keep that in mind. You're stronger there. And so therefore some people want to emphasize that. They're like, well, if we slow the eccentrics way down, right? We slow the eccentrics way down, we can get more work there because we can recruit more muscle fibers resisting it on the way down. And a lot of that's been looked at. And what's been found is that when people do eccentrics, like 4-second eccentrics versus 1-second eccentrics, they don't seem to gain any more muscle mass. Meaning about a 1-second lowering of a weight is usually sufficient to get the eccentric response needed to grow muscle mass, to elicit additional hypertrophy benefits versus just doing concentric only training. But it comes at a price also. The more eccentric reps you do, the more sore that you get. Now I understand there's a lot of people out there who need that. All right, get some coffee down. I'm getting a little hoarse there. Throat's dry. That they need to feel sore, or they need to get these certain feelings, or a pump, or they need to feel certain things in order to feel like they've made progress and to keep themselves motivated. But people need to understand that's not necessary for growth. If that's something you personally need for some psychological reason, then do what you have to do. Do some extra eccentric work just to make yourself sore so that you can feel better about the whole thing. And if you feel better about the whole thing and that'll keep you more motivated, then, do what you have to do. But for a lot of people, additional soreness with no additional progress isn't a positive thing. It's like me, for example. I do very high frequency training. I do a ton of training. I'm older. I'm in my 40s now. I'm going to hurt a little bit anyways, just due to my age, whether I train or not. I don't need to induce additional soreness in order to feel my body when I wake up first thing in the morning. If anything, I would rather minimize that. So for me, I only care about, is this going to make me stronger? Is this going to help me gain muscle? Is this going to make me faster, more explosive, help me lift a heavier weight? Am I going to perform better as a result of this? And a lot of that, the answer is no. Now, it's ironic the guy asked me about the whole Glenn Pendlay thing, or the Pendlay rows, because, again, we associate that with Glenn Pendlay, Glenn Penlay is big on bulking his lifters on concentric only training. In other words, what he always finds is that, well, yeah, you have to do a little more work. You've got to do more total reps if you skip eccentric based exercises completely and focus on concentrics to gain muscle. But they also tend to make you more explosive, and you can just do the extra work. So he tends to have his guys, when he wants to bring them up a weight class, when they go through a bulking phase, he puts a heavy emphasis on very high volume concentric explosive training. That's what do we know from the research. We know the more explosively you lift a weight, this has been looked at in recent studies, the more muscle activation you get. In fact, it even trumps the mind-muscle connection in terms of that, right? It trumps it. It's got bodybuilding methods beat hands down when we look at it in the lab. Lifting explosively. Well, if you do exercises where you can more or less skip the eccentric or lower the eccentric very fast, then you don't have to deal with the soreness and other stuff from eccentrics and the micro tearing of the connective tissue, and you can focus on just exploding with the weight over and over. You have to do a few more reps. You might have to do an extra set or two, but you'll get maximum results. You can maximize muscle growth just fine that way, but you're getting a different performance element. People say, well, what do you mean? I don't know, Penlay rows, snatch grip, deadlifts, push presses, power cleans, whatever they need to do. Those sort of exercises can all be done without an eccentric component, to where you lower the weight relatively quickly, or in some cases even more or less turn loose at the top safely. And that works fine for those sort of athletes, bulking them up. They don't necessarily have to do eccentrics. So kind of we get into the question of asking, so do you really need eccentric reps? Not necessarily. I mean, it's a choice. It is a choice of what you want to do. But I would suggest that a heavier focus on just being able to do more work on big exercises that you can lift fairly quickly is probably a better option if you're trying to maximize muscle growth. And then you get to certain muscles that are tricky, like the hamstring. That's a perfect example. The Romanian deadlift can help resolve that with the eccentric-based reps. Now, you could do that. There's nothing wrong with that. If that's what you need to do to beef your hamstrings up, then by all means carry on. But you need to keep in mind there are other options. With the advent of like a glute ham raise, that's more or less made the need for that particular exercise to bring up the hamstrings. It's kind of obsolete. If you have access to a glute ham raise, that actually gives a more complete hamstring development than hip hinge only movements, right? Because of the three heads of the hamstrings, hip hinging movements tend to leave one of the three heads slightly lagging. The glute ham raise hits it pretty hard. So in terms of actually working all the heads of the hamstring very effectively, the glute ham raise is probably the best exercise ever invented. If you have access to one of those, you don't need to worry about stuff like that anymore. You can just jump on the glute ham raise and use it as a primary hamstring builder in addition to your normal training if you need to bring your hamstrings up. And in some cases, that's simply an issue of injury prevention, right? It can actually help reduce injury rates to have a little bit bigger and stronger hamstrings than you might need for whatever you happen to be doing. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But people who don't have access to that, if you don't want to deal with the soreness from the eccentric component of the Romanian deadlift, because it is an eccentric-based exercise, whereas in a normal deadlift is a concentric-based exercise. And you guys remember the Romanian, you're lowering it slowly and then snapping up with your hamstrings like a rubber band before you get to the floor. There are other exercises that you can do in higher volumes, because that's what we run into. The issue is it's hard to deadlift with a high volume and recover from it. The Romanian deadlift removes a lot of that axial loading and other components to the deadlift that make it so fatiguing. So the people who want to specifically bring up their hamstrings, it works. But you could also do deficit deadlifts. You could do snatch grip deadlifts. Those are variations that are better hypertrophy-oriented exercises than, say, the normal conventional deadlift. But they also hit the hamstrings harder. So if you wanted to bring up your hamstrings, those exercises could work just as well as a Romanian deadlift. They're going to make you less sore. You can do a fair amount of volume on them. So that's also an option for people who need to bring up lagging hamstrings instead of the Romanian deadlift, if that's they don't want to deal with the soreness and other stuff that comes from an eccentric-based exercise. So you do have other options, although I would obviously say something like a glute ham raise eliminates that problem. If you have access to one of those, your problem is solved. So other muscles, though, there's no other real muscles in the body that we necessarily need these eccentric-based lifts in order to bring up. Maybe pecs, because, you know, by its very nature, it's very difficult for a lot of people to lower a bench press really fast. I'm one of those people. It's hard. People have to teach themselves how to do that. So a lot of your chest-based exercises and chest presses, you might have a strong eccentric component. There might be no real way around that unless you could train yourself to lower the weight fairly quickly. But outside of that, it's not really necessary for you to do an eccentric exercise if you don't want to, in order to maximize muscle growth. Because at the end of the day, it is about how many muscle fibers you recruited, how much muscle activation was there, how much work you did with a given muscle, and then so you have the stress end, and then you have the stress recovery adaptation cycle. So then you need the recovery, the adaptation. So you need the fuel, the sleep, the rest, and maybe the active recovery, whatever else is going on to get those gains. But you can do all of that without really any sort of eccentric based exercise or slow eccentrics. And I'm not saying if you enjoy doing slow eccentrics and that's what you want to do for your gains, and you actually want the extra soreness and other stuff because you need it for some psychological reason, then by all means carry on. But for a lot of us, as we get older and we train longer and longer, that sort of stuff becomes really just what's the word I'm looking for? It becomes a minor aggravation that if you're not getting any benefit from it, you know, you stop caring about stuff like that. And that's how it is for me at this point in the game. I only care about just getting my gains. I just want to get stronger. And for me, even gaining muscle is there purely to help me get stronger. That's the only reason I care about gaining muscle at this point, because it's going to make me stronger. So that's what you have to weigh out, is that what is it that you specifically want out of your training, both psychologically and physically when thinking about that. But remember, eccentric base reps are just one tool in the toolbox. They're not necessary. They can be useful. They have been useful for many people. But again, they're just like every other tool in the toolbox. They're not always necessary, but they're there available if you choose to use them. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.